Hi, I'm Dan. I live here in Middlebury. I'm somewhat a very amateur paddler, and I'm be humbled by much of what you do. But through Peter, I got involved in the Northern Forest Canoe Trail and have been on the board of director for a little less than a year. And who has heard of the Northern Forest Canoe Trail, NFCT? How many people are members of NFCT? Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, the NFCT was founded in 2006 as a nonprofit association. Of course, the association was founded, the trail has been there for eons. But what the association did, was some of the founders of the Mad River Canoe had a great interest in connecting the waterways that were used by the Native American people, the settlers, and explorers for various routes. It crosses many waterways. Obviously, you probably know, and Peter will tell you, it goes from Old Forge, New York to Fort Kent, Maine. It's made up of 27 rivers and streams, 59 lakes and ponds, and 45 communities it crosses through. Our purpose as the association is to help be the stewards of this trail. We are always in the process and have developed many things to make the trail more connectable through portages or carries, whatever state you're from, to better access to the waterways. And we liaison with the various state organizations, private landowners to connect these trails and give us all access to these trails. Peter's going to talk about the adventure side of the trail in that a through paddle, but obviously the association is more interested in drawing people to these waterways, to helping us foster relationships between the outdoors and the communities to make it profitable for some people who live along the waterways and make their living in the waterways. And we have taken on the stewardship of this waterways, and we operate through grants, donations, sponsorships from the major canoe companies, paddle companies, outdoor organizations, and membership. And I would encourage you to see our website, the NFCT, the Northern Forest Canoe Trail website, and see the planning tools we have there for any length of trip, and see what we do in our stewardship area, and again, encourage you to become members. And my sole purpose tonight, my big purpose, is to introduce Peter Macfarlane. I first met Peter, I think your talk was in 2014, but your trip was in 2013. He was a through paddler in 2013. We have anywhere from 8 to 10 people a year that through paddle, and some of us, I came to his talk sitting here, and when I walked out, my wife looked at me and she says, "Oh no, you're going to do this. I don't even own a canoe." And I said, "Yes, I am." Well, Peter is a purist. He does this the entire trip under human power. I mean, every foot he's crossing this thing, he's walked, and I forgot to tell you, there's 65 carries in here, and and that's designed going down water, so whatever direction if you go through like a normal through paddler, it comes out to a lot more than that, usually about 110 miles of carry. So the only thing I proved is that two 65-year-old coots could paddle a canoe this far and carry it that far, so don't ever give up. But Peter was an inspiration to me. He helped me plan my trip. I got to go paddling with him in his boat that he built, and I'm sure I know it was the same boat that did both trips. And Peter's greatest, I haven't seen a whole lot of people paddle, but he is remarkable in his paddling ability. Was a kayak racer at one time in his life, and he's a great, gentle soul, an exceptional teacher, and I learned a lot the day paddling with him. And he's fearless when it comes to any sea state and any river. So Peter is also a musician. He teaches fiddle. He plays in a band, and also he builds cedar-strip canoes. And I encourage everybody to, even if you're not gonna get Peter to build a boat for you, to go to his shop and see his boats. They are breathtakingly beautiful, and incredible craftsmen, and they are incredibly light. I paddle the easy one, a Winona Kevlar and a Hornbeck. They're extremely light, and his are not much heavier, and they're made of wood. So with that, let's hear the story, Peter.
Thank you, Dan. Follow that. And also thanks to the good folks at the Ilsley Library here for hosting this. And especially thank you to all of you for coming out. Because solo travel is a beautiful thing, and especially when you can share it with somebody. Now, as Dan mentioned, 2013 in the spring, I did a through paddle of the Northern Forest Canoe Trail. Nominally, it's 740 miles. I did a few more because apparently I like paddling in torrential rain and cold. But that's another story already told here. But after that, I'd been looking to get back on the trail, but if you just try and repeat the same journey, it's often a disappointment. So I wanted there to be a difference. Now, as Dan said, well, that was the end of the last one. As Dan said, the Northern Forest Canoe Trail runs between Old Forge in the southwestern Adirondacks and Fort Kent, which is on the St. John River in northern Maine. So it includes the Adirondacks, Lake Champlain, northern Vermont with a bit of Quebec, northern New Hampshire, and about half the miles are in Maine. And as he intimated, then there are big lakes, small ponds, big rivers, small streams, upstream, downstream, placid water, white water, everything for the paddler except for salt water. And something in excess of 50 miles of portage. I didn't think it was quite 110, but it felt like it at times. Now, in the register of through paddlers, up until spring 2018, all entries had gone from Old Forge to Fort Kent, west to east. A trip which involves 9 major downstream rivers and 4 major upstream. Like common sense. Looking for a difference, you're ahead of me. Looking for a difference, I decided to try and be the first recorded to do it the other way, east to west. And it was going to be a challenge, fair enough, and it was going to involve much more upstream than down. Now, there were things about my previous trip which were worth repeating. My choice of canoe, a cedar-strip that I designed and built, that's the one that served me so well last time. I dubbed it the little canoe that could and did, and there was no good reason to change, so I didn't. My approach to portaging, to single all the carries, would require the same balanced loading of paddles and poles in the canoe, and all gear to be in a single pack. I don't like walking there, back, and there again. I just want to do it once. I would sleep in a camping hammock, not have to find flat ground for a tent. And I would paddle in the spring when chances are there'd be enough water. It worked last time, for those who heard my previous talk. Experience, however, dictated a few changes. I'd now made an underquilt for my hammock, one which could accept an extra layer under my torso, because no doubt some of the nights in Maine would be chilly, and that gives underside insulation. I carried more warm clothing for both paddling and nights. I wasn't planning on suffering hypothermia again. Again, yeah. And I carried the same lightweight twig stove as last time, but also from the start, I carried a little gas stove and 1 cylinder as a backup for when continuous rain would soak all of the available wood. As a teacher, I always like my students to learn from their experiences. I also planned a 28-day schedule, which is the same as last time. Partly because I'm self-employed, so I have to make a living, and partly because I like symmetry. And I had no idea if that schedule was going to be feasible, but had every intention of sticking to it. So, late April. I'm busy watching webcams, looking at the ice retreating in Maine painfully slowly. It was quite a cold winter up there. Then on the 1st of May, I got email advising of thick ice on the Allagash headwater lakes and heavy flow on the Allagash and the St. John rivers. That's the opening upstream gambit of nearly 100 miles. The Allagash was over its banks. The St. John, just upstream of the confluence, was flowing at 70,000 cubic feet per second. Now, if you don't know about the figures, just accept it. That's big. And at that point, I was toying with the idea of delaying the start, especially in the middle of sleepless nights. But after a couple of weeks of watching online data, the graphs gradually coming down, by the time we got to 12th of May, the day I was due to leave home, the flow rates were only a little above the seasonal norms, and at least Moosehead Lake was free of ice, as far as I could tell from the webcam. So that night, I spent with friends in New Hampshire. No, we don't need anything yet. Spent with friends in New Hampshire, and they were going to drive me to Fort Kent the next day. I woke in the morning, my eyes focused on the bookshelf by my bed, and came to rest on one particular spine. I kid you not, the Darwin Awards. So, several hours in the car brought us to Fort Kent, a few hundred miles. Checked into a motel, and then went to look at the river. This was the moment of truth. Would it be paddleable? If not, would I abandon the whole idea? I had to make a decision there and then so that these good folks didn't have to come back a second time to pick me up. And as we climbed the levee to look at the river, I was as nervous then, nearly as nervous as I am now, as nervous then as I've ever been before a paddling experience. And on cresting the levee and seeing the river, the surge of relief that went through me was powerful. It was flowing, but it wouldn't be totally insane to try to ascend it. So, next morning, 7 o'clock, blue sky, bright sun, signed the register, took the necessary posed photographs, and I set off. Now, time doesn't permit me to bore you with the details of every day, but I'll focus on some of the highlights and some of the decision-making along the way. The first few days were upstream, including against rapids. And following the success of using 2 ski poles for double poling last time, I was carrying them again, but initially I paddled. And one of the first decisions was whether to change sides of the river to find the slacker water on the inside of the bend. Well, with the speed of flow and the width of the river, I'd have lost far too much ground to make that worthwhile. The benefit would not have paid off. So I stuck to paddling and paddled along the shoreline, along the bank, and where it was too shallow, get there in a bit. This was the opening, crossing the outflow of the Fish River. That was the first thing. There's the okay. Yeah. So I paddled along the bank, where necessary, where it wasn't deep enough. I switched to my shorter paddle with a wider blade, suitable for shallower water, and switched back and forth quite seamlessly. And after about an hour, after about an hour, I was paddling into a 15-mile-an-hour headwind. Headwinds were to become a feature of this trip. I was expecting the prevailing winds to be against me, but there was wind perversity in my future. A bit further upstream, came across some rapids. The paddling became less effective, so I took to the poling technique, double poling, kneeling, and that took me up several miles of the St. John River. And then eventually, when that was tiring me. I took the plunge and had to get out and wade and tow the canoe by the bow line. Now, I was wearing dry pants and I had some river boots with 5mm neoprene liners, and I was glad to see that they did the job. It wasn't uncomfortable, even though this was still largely meltwater. That night, I pulled into a campsite, my planned campsite, just before 7 o'clock. So that's nearly 12 hours. On schedule, 12 hours of pretty hard work, but not exhausting. And 12-hour days were to be pretty much the norm for a lot of this trip. Next day, I carried on the same combination of paddling, poling, wading, up to the confluence with the Allagash, and then up the Allagash to Allagash Falls, which was the first carry. I did most of my early paddling in the Adirondacks. I talk about carries. Above the falls, the current was drawing inexorably back towards the drop. It's about a 40-foot drop. So it was a game of patience to escape from that. And having escaped from it, I then sent an OK signal from a spot GPS messenger. Some of you, I see some nodding, some of you know what that is. It sends a message and it leaves a waypoint online. And that was just to let folks back at home know that A, I was still alive, and B, I'd managed to get past this particular source of danger. A bit further upstream, there was nobody present at Michaud Farm, no ranger present to check in, so I just left a note of my itinerary. That's the entrance to the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. And then camped that night, and that was a really frosty night, hard frost. The underquilt worked fine on the hammock. The water in my water bottle froze. The water I put in the cooking pot for breakfast froze. A first for me, my toothpaste froze. And my boots froze solid. In the morning, I had to boil extra water to thaw them out. There were to be several frosty nights through the first 10 days or so.
Is the water going north or south?
The water's going north here. I'm going upstream here. Next day, day 3, saw the first disaster. Coming up a long stretch of rapids towards Round Pond, it was a mixture of poling and wading. And I'd been very, very careful about stowing my poles. On my last trip, I had to return downstream to retrieve one, which apparently I'd missed the canoe and trying to put it back in. So this time I was being very disciplined about stowing them. Approaching Round Pond, towing the canoe, looked down, one ski pole. Doesn't work with one pole. I didn't know where it had got lost. I assume a bit of springy vegetation had flicked it out when I wasn't looking. And I really couldn't face going back downstream, having worked so hard to get up the rapids, on what might possibly be a wild goose chase. So I carried on now with only 2 tools in my upstream toolbox. Spent that night on Long Lake, well positioned for the Chase Rapids the next morning. Chase Rapids, that's about a 4.5-mile stretch of rapids at the top of the Allagash, the biggest rapids on the Allagash, leading to Churchill Dam. And next morning, fairly soon got to Bissonnet Bridge and launched into these rapids. Started off by eddy hopping, paddle up an eddy, across the current, up the next eddy behind a rock, across a current, and so on. And it was really effective, a thing of great beauty, in fact. I even mounted my camera on the gunnel and took some video of this, sometimes 4 or 5 such maneuvers before taking a break and planning the next sequence. And it was really effective, until the current got a bit stronger. Then, not having any poles now, it was a case of getting out and wading. And pulling the canoe up falls, maneuvering it between rocks. And that was when I found that the rocks here, in fact everywhere, are coated with algae, which secrete mucilage, algal slime. They were extremely slippery. So my feet were going all over the place. And I'd fall down frequently, have to regain footing to stop being swept downstream. Despite that, this combination of eddy hopping and wading took me pretty rapidly up the first 4 miles of the Chase Rapids. And then about probably half a mile from Churchill Dam, I slipped over yet again and let out this stream of invective, only to realise that there's a fisherman just over there. He overlooked my language and pointed out that there was a portage path. And now, I'd been really determined to stay in the river where possible, but the combination of slippery rocks and fatigue was now an injury risk. So I let my head rule my heart and took out to carry. And another fisherman who was there shot some video while I was doing it and sent it along later. The first part of this was a little bit of a bushwhack, but once I got onto the portage path, it was no more than 10 minutes to the dam. That was confirming the estimate of about half a mile. And when I got to the dam, it was still early afternoon. I checked in with the ranger, paid my dues, and I was ahead of schedule, not least because of a remarkably fast ascent of the Chase Rapids. I'd surprised even myself.
How much did your canoe weigh?
37 pounds.
Was that snow?
Sorry?
Was that snow?
No, there wasn't any, no, I didn't meet any snow. There was still some ice on the banks of Moosehead Lake, but no, that was probably just dead leaves. So, it being early afternoon, I carried on and gained a few miles on my schedule and spent the night at an idyllic little campsite on Eagle Lake. And it was another frosty night. And that was well positioned for the mud pond carry the next day. Now has anyone done the mud pond carry? Oh, one, okay. We need to talk. It's a bit of a rite of passage. It's a traditional carry between Umbazookskus Lake and Mud Pond. And because of wear and tear over the years, it's basically a drainage channel leading up to a height of land and another one going down the other side, and involves wading through deep mud, about roughly 1.7 miles. Nobody seems to agree on how long it is. So, the next morning, quick traverse of Eagle Lake, carried along the tramway, that's a relic of an old log-moving device, and then did a long traverse of Champlain Lake, which was beautiful under blue sky, totally different from my previous experience of it. Then a short carry into Mud Pond, and at that point, I took a compass bearing across to where the start of the carry should be. I've never been there before, so last time I did a loop off to the west, so I haven't seen this before. And followed that compass bearing, got to the other side, and there was a bit of an inlet there and a couple of signs, one saying Chesuncook, 11 miles. I thought, this has got to be it. Took out onto floating bog, picked up my canoe, the bog sank, so I got to the next bit of floating bog, which sank. This is Stairmaster Extreme. And was soon on dry land, following a fairly flat, open path, which agreed with the compass direction. This is great. Maybe it's just my good luck that there was a dry spring. And all was going wonderfully well until I came across a transverse bog blocking my path. So after some scouting, I went round the right-hand end of it, and the path seemed to continue. So I followed it, still on the right compass bearing, maybe displaced off to the north a bit. But this path began to get ever less clear. The vegetation got ever more dense, saplings. And I'd push into somewhere that looked like a trail and realise it wasn't. Back out, try something different. Turning round with a canoe on your head needs a turning circle. And after a few of these shunts, you sort of lose track of where you've just come from. So going back isn't an option. So I pushed forwards, pushing through between trees, and it was now clear that I wasn't on any kind of a trail. And this continued, just following the compass bearing, until I reached a point where the canoe would not fit between the trees. Furthermore, my water bottle, full at the start of the carry, was now approaching empty. In short, I was stuck, lost in the Maine woods, with no access to water, in the heat of the day. I'm not one to panic easily, but actively had to quell the rising panic at that point. I knew there was a road off to the west somewhere, and another one to the south. So if really necessary, I could abandon the canoe and save myself. And that thought really did go through my head. And if you know how much I'm attached to that canoe, you understand. But it also meant I had nothing to lose. So now this became a portage of brute force. I just rammed the canoe through between saplings, forcing saplings apart, spaces that were far too small for it. It was the only option. And after, I don't know how long doing this, I didn't measure it, I suddenly emerged into a region where trees had been felled but not yet collected. And in sheer relief at the freedom, I was just bounding trunk to trunk until I remembered I was thirsty. So I put everything down to take stock. At that point, I realized that my camera, clipped to my pack belt, was no longer there. You wonder where the video of ascending the Allagash was? Cameras are replaceable. What was on the memory card was the first 4.5 days of that trip, which suddenly and sickeningly became pointless because I wouldn't be able to share it with anyone. Why do you think I'm using maps? But there was a higher priority, water. I found a little post hole with some brown stagnant stuff in it, managed to pump out about 2/3 of a litre before the filter clogged completely. And then, from my Spot GPS messenger, I sent the only delayed message I've ever sent. And that would let folks back at home know that I had a problem. If I sent a second one of those, it's a real problem. Be on the lookout to have to come and get me. If I sent a follow-up okay, problems resolved. Now, I decided to try and backtrack, retrace my steps, and look for the camera. But it soon became obvious that I was risking losing sight of the canoe and the pack, which would compound the problem. So with a very heavy heart, I abandoned that search. But now, applying logic, the machinery that felled these trees came in almost certainly from one of the roads. If I follow the line of felling, I will get to a road. Sure enough, I did. Sent an OK message because the orientation of the road told me which one it was, and I followed it down to the foot of Umbazookskus Lake and started down Umbazookskus Stream, the first short, but the first downstream. It should have been a really joyful paddle, and it wasn't. Yes, I'd singled the mud pond carry, but at a cost, and not by the traditional route. Partway down Umbazookskus Stream, it occurred to me that I could use my phone as a camera. Duh! Because I'm a phone for talking to people, camera for taking pictures kind of person. Old-fashioned, old school. It's not waterproof, would have to be protected, would be easy to drop overboard, but I was carrying a solar charger, so as long as the sun carried on shining, I'd have pictures. That night, I was just a few miles into the west branch of the Penobscot, just off Chesuncook Lake, it's Pine Stream, for anyone who knows it, and spent the night there. Next day, plied upstream into a stiff southerly wind up the Penobscot, and then the northeast carry brought me across to Moosehead Lake. Here I was at the north end of the biggest lake in Maine, facing a 20+ mile/hour south wind. My original target of Sabumak Point was a bit on the exposed side, and it could leave me stranded. Other than staying put, the alternative was to come down the eastern shore to a sheltered campsite in Big Duck Cove, which now became my aim. But the first problem was launching. So I placed the canoe with the bow in the water, loaded the pack, paddle in hand, waited for a small set of waves, picked up the stern to float the bow, ran it through the first couple of waves, jumped in behind the seat to lift the bow over the next couple of waves before adopting a more normal position. And then, I'm not really that daft. I didn't try and slog into the lake slog into the wind mid-lake. I ferry glided across to the eastern shore, and as close as depth and breaking waves would allow, I inched my way down that shore. And every paddle stroke was accelerating the canoe from scratch, taking something near maximum effort. It was a long, slow slog in the rain to reach that campsite. That evening vindicated my decision to carry an extra set of waterproof gear, because I could change into dry clothing, dry camp clothing, and keep it dry. Forgot to say earlier, this extra stuff I was carrying, I allowed for the extra weight by carrying less food at any one time. I had 3 resupplies instead of 1. Next day, I completed the crossing of Moosehead Lake in rather calmer conditions, and then, so that's from about here, came up the Moose River to Brasseur Dam, and then out into Brasseur Lake to head northwest. The wind that was strong and southerly yesterday was equally strong and northwesterly now. So by the time I'd got round there and then got across Little Brasseur Lake to the outflow of the Moose River, it was fairly well into afternoon. It was still too early to stop, but the next campsites available were on Long Pond, a few miles away, upstream still. And one look at the rapids in front of me told me my progress up those is going to be too slow to make a campsite by dark. So I opted for the official demo road carry, which is a 3.6 mile loop, something like that, around that section. And then put back in for a bit more upstream. That's the kind of upstream I was facing. And that eventually brought me out into Long Pond, where I was now heading due west into a 20 to 25 mile an hour westerly wind. Today was finishing just like yesterday. And by the time I pulled into a campsite, somewhat exhausted, it was about 7 o'clock at night. This was over a 12-hour day. At which point, of course, the wind died. My target the next day was Jackman. It's only 11 miles away, and the physical exertion of the last few days told me that my body was looking forward to a half day of rest. Now, those 11 miles were a bit tougher than I really wanted them to be, but do we have anything? I've forgotten if there's... No, we'll go back. But late morning, I pulled into Jackman, checked into the motel, picked up my mailed food package, took a shower, the first of the trip, this is day 8, and collapsed on the bed. A little while later, checking email, I saw a disturbing message telling me my spot waypoints had dried up at the mouth of the Allagash. And that threw me into a spin, because that was the only evidence that I knew of that was telling people I was still alive. I had to make contact. My own phone didn't have any reception. The payphone at the neighbouring store was now out of order, but the motel owner took pity, and I made contact with my support crew and got the cheery response, your messages have been coming through just fine. And anyway, if they hadn't, we'd have got in touch with the Allagash Rangers, which of course I knew to be true anyway. The rest of that day disappeared with eating, sleeping, buying hand salve. This is what long days of paddling do. Buying hand salve, doing a bit of laundry, and also drying my boots in the sun. We can run fairly quickly through the next day. Further up the Moose River, 5.5 mile carryover so that I could now paddle into a stiff south wind, south down Fish Pond and Spencer Lake, and then some really bony downstream on Little Spencer Stream and Spencer Stream. That spat me out onto the Dead River just below Grand Falls, where I spent the night. Next day can be quite quick as well. Upstream on the Dead River until it reached Flagstaff Lake, where as I exited the sheltered northeast arm of the lake to turn northwest, I now turned into a force 5 northwesterly. My decision making here wasn't great. I tried finding shelter on the north shore. That wasn't good enough. Tried the south shore, found none there. Tried the north shore again. No, south shore. Three open water crossings when one would have been enough. Don't ask. But despite that, when I reached the western end of Flagstaff Lake near Stratton, it was still too early to stop. So I then headed out up the south branch of the Dead River. And this is a section which a lot of through paddlers bypass because there's usually not enough water. It's bony. But I wanted to have a look at it and at least give it a go. I had, however, researched various exit strategies whereby I could get out to the main road. And so at the end of that day, having paddled and waded up a few miles and waded on more slippery rocks, more than was good for my sanity, my health, probably my vocabulary. Then I got to the first bridge and camped there deliberately so that the next morning I'd have the option of carrying on in the river or carrying out to the road. Next morning, decision made. If I was going to have to walk anyway, I might as well make some good mileage and not fall over as much. So here began a day on which I would carry for a little over 17 miles. In one day, yes. During which I found that neoprene-lined boots are a little bit warm when you're hiking many miles along a road on a hot day. For the last few miles of the Dead River, I was back in the river, gave up carrying and got back in where it was more paddleable, except that that was punctuated by a lot of deadfall, which required some imaginative portaging. And then when I took out at the top of the Dead River, that's the 5th upstream river completed, top of the Dead River, I decided that another 4+ miles of carrying would be rewarded by a stay in a real bed. So I carried up and over the hill to Rangeley, Maine, and booked into a B&B for the night. And heading out to a restaurant that evening, I must have been a comical sight, somewhat sigmoid. Now the next morning, headed out onto Rangeley Lake and the wind was already getting up. And a fisherman advised me that 30-mile-an-hour winds were forecast from the west, my direction of travel. And so going along the northern shore, crossing the bays on the northern shore, I put into practice a technique that I'd had plenty of opportunity to practice. That is, when in the lulls of the wind, head straight into it, make way into it in the required direction, and then, when it blows really hard, ferry glide further into the bay, sacrifice some forward motion as an investment in greater shelter later on. And that was successful. It took me over to Moose-McGuntic Lake, where the westerly grew stronger. I got almost the identical picture last time, except the sky wasn't blue. Beat across to the west side, ferry glided south across some bays, did a quick carry over into Upper Richardson Lake, where, true to form, there were rollers piling down from the northwest. And in addition, the strong westerly wind was blowing a second set of waves up, coming straight east towards me. So these were converging and creating fairly tumultuous conditions, into which, as Dan intimated earlier, I wasn't hesitant about setting out. The goal of reaching the far side, however, was easier said than done. And by the time I got there, I'd been forced several miles to the south in a long ferry glide. It was a long crossing not for the faint of heart. So I was glad to be able to get to a private camp where I could stay that night on Lower Richardson Lake. Next day, day 13, I was due to meet my support crew at the bottom of the Androscoggin in New Hampshire. So I set out early and made quick work of the 4+ mile rapid river carry. And And that brought me to Umbagog Lake, the end of the trail in Maine, and roughly half distance. And then down the Androscoggin. This is the first major downstream. And it had plenty of water in it, and there were nice rapids with nice channels, navigable channels. This was joyful downstream paddling. I'd worked hard for this, really hard for this, and enjoyed it to the full. And then, just as I was lining up to go through Seven Islands Bridge, it didn't matter it was raining. As I was lining up to go through Seven Islands Bridge, suddenly saw my support crew on the bank, Hildy with camera, shooting video, and Ray announcing that a cup of tea awaited. So I took a quick break there and then carried on downstream, eventually reaching Pontoc Dam. And then below Pontoc Dam, the rapids are a little bit bony, but the alternative was to carry along the road. So who wants to do that? So I took on the rapids. I only hit one rock going down here. That one was a bit hard, though. I needed some tape to repair the split for a while. And eventually took out the bottom of these rapids and went home with a support crew. And pizza and ice cream that night made a real nice change from dried food. Next morning, Ray dropped me off exactly where they'd picked me up, so I missed nothing. And that was ready for a 4+ mile carry up and over to the upper Ammonoosuc River for a second day of downstream. A lot of placid water at low level, also some technical rapids. I ran almost all of them. There's just a very few yards in Stark, New Hampshire, where I carried. But it was a wonderful, wonderful trip downstream, except for the noise from ATVs on the North Shore, and also somebody firing off 31 rounds repeatedly. Whatever floats your boat. And at the end of that day, Ray and Hildy appeared at my planned campsite bringing home-cooked dinner. Getting soft here. And we enjoyed that while a few million mosquitoes tried to do likewise. And when my friends disappeared for the night, I'm not ashamed to say I went across the road and booked a room in a motel. Next day I was heading up the Connecticut, up back to upstream, which I misjudged. I thought the Connecticut was a sluggish river. No, it was low, it was flowing. And the insides of the bends were heavily silted, preventing paddling or poling. Ray had found me a spare pole, and now I had two again. So I was forced to the outsides of the bends. And further up, it was shallow and rocky, and I did a lot of poling up there and some wading, but it was a much harder ascent than I was planning on. And by the time I got to the confluence with the Nullhegan, it's where I'm going to branch off into Vermont for sure, then it was clear that paddling or poling up the Nullhegan wasn't on. It was far too bony. Even wading that would have been silly, so I just carried a couple of miles along the road to stay in a newly built hut, getting really soft.
The NFCT built that hut.
Yes, help build it, and it was commissioned by the Vermont River Commission.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Next day was the Nullhegan. Now, on my previous trip coming down this, I'd bypassed quite a large section of it because of bony rapids. But this time I really wanted to see what it had to offer. And so I carried a stone dam, put in, and headed upstream. And here was a section of upstream that I'm really proud of. It was tough, it was technical, heaving the loaded canoe up falls, maneuvering it between rocks. But whilst it was exhausting, it was immensely satisfying. And all the time balancing on slippery rocks and swatting away black flies. But eventually I got to the impassable gorge section and followed the carry trail as far as the railway, and then just a few yards along the railway before putting back in, I missed almost none of this river. And then in the upper stretches of it, I was glad to have researched where streams converge, because that's an upstream nightmare. You get to a fork which fork do you take? From time elapsed and speed of travel, I knew which fork I'd reached, therefore which way to turn. Another challenge of upstream travel is, of course, beaver dams. And when I got to above Nulhegan Pond, took out for a carry along the road to Spectacle Pond to spend the night at Brighton State Park. You can come and sit if you like. Are you happy? Okay. To spend the night at Brighton State Park. Despite missing the turning, it seems that signs for portages favour those going in the conventional direction. This happened a number of times. Next day, paddled through the morning mist on Spectacle Pond, crossed over Island Pond to a bakery the other side. I was really looking forward to fresh bread, and it was a disappointment. More air than bread. But the day got better after that, heading down the Clyde River. Blue sky, bright sun, wind mainly at my back. Doesn't often happen. A few dead falls to get around, but otherwise I was making really good progress. The fen was easier to navigate downstream than upstream. You just go with the flow. And I was thinking my aim of getting to a lean-to above Clyde Pond was perhaps a bit conservative. So now I shifted my focus to a campsite on Lake Memphremagog, north of Newport, and carried on downstream. And got to West Charleston, carried past the dam and the hydro. And at the put-in, it was looking a bit bony, on the edge of what would be advisable in a wooden canoe. The alternative was to continue carrying along the road, so I launched. And about 15 yards downstream, I suddenly was able to see just how bony and steep the next falls were. So my lousy decision to launch was followed by a perfect one, which was to jump out, get feet on rocks, and haul the canoe to the bank. Disaster averted. And then got permission to use somebody's backyard to get to the road, because carrying along the road was now the better idea. And I put in a bit further down, had some swift water, some riffles, but where the rapids started getting steeper again, I cashed in my chips, took out and carried down into Newport to paddle out onto Lake Memphremagog to head north to Eagle Point campsite, which is near the Canadian border. And it was now a race against fading daylight. Before I could get there, a campground on the east seemed to develop very strong gravity, and it sucked me in. And it was a brilliant decision. They had hot showers free to campers. Next day, went north on Lake Memphremagog. For anyone who knows about my previous trip, you'll see the weather was much better this time. North of Memphremagog, checked in with Canadian Customs by phone here. It seems that all boats entering Canada need a name and a colour. So my canoe is now known as Peter's Canoe. And wood is officially a colour. A few miles further north, I took out for the Grand Portage. This is the longest official carry on the trail, 5.7 miles of road west over into the Missisquoi Valley. Less than a mile into that, a guy with a truck pulled up, offered me a ride. He was the guy who lived in the house nearest the other end, about 200 yards short. I'm sure he doesn't understand to this day why I declined. So a couple of sweaty hours later, I went past his house and reached the Missisquoi Valley. Now, this is the river which was in flood when I went up it 5 years ago. Now I was deep between the banks, looking up 6 or 8 feet at the trees that I'd certainly pushed through on that occasion. And carried on downstream in shallow conditions, got to Mansonville, where the Owl's Head Bakery was open this time, so I got a loaf of real bread and devoured it on the town green. And then continued downriver and pulled into Canoe & Company. That's an outfitter in Glen Sutton. And last time I was there, I poled up onto their lawn at about that level. Now, the international border just downstream at East Richford was due to close for bridge repair. And the alternative route that had been established was an 8-mile carry up and down a big hill, which did not appeal. My support crew had devised this very elaborate plan whereby I could avoid that, not miss any of the trail, and yet still enter the US legally. I'd paddled down to the border at the bridge, but not across it, back upstream to where Vivica, my wife, would pick me up, having entered Canada via a different crossing. She would bring me back through that crossing, take me up to near the bridge. I would paddle up to the border at the bridge, not across it, and then continue down. A phone call a couple of days previously had established the border would still be open. So the planning came to naught. I was originally going to meet Vivica in Richford, but I was well ahead of schedule, so changed that to Enosburg Falls, further downstream. And even so, I was there by about 2 o'clock. And when she arrived to pick me up, at that point I retired from the trail for a rest day the next day, on which I was due to play a musical gig. So we spent the night in Grey Gables B&B in Richford, and then decamped to Lancaster the following day. Sunday, next day, day 21, back on the river. Missisquoi continuing downstream. It was low, but even so I managed to stay in the river and run all of the rapids. They were technical. The Abbey Rapids here, East Highgate Ledges, and then got to Highgate campsite, a bit further downstream, and found that there were rather more mosquitoes than I really wanted to spend the night with. So for the second time, chose a motel over mosquitoes and pushed on to Swanton. The next day was due to be the roughest weather of the trip. Very strong southerly winds, heavy rain. It's also the day I was due to emerge onto Lake Champlain. Deja vu. The sixth largest lake in the country. Vivica's advice was to stay put in the motel, which was probably wise. So the next morning I set out into the rain and out through the Missisquoi Delta, and the nearer I got to the lake, the more the trees were bending. And when I emerged into the lake, all significant downstream now finished, I was hit by this blast of wind from the south. Well, being no stranger to headwind at this point, I accepted the challenge and headed into it. Emerged here, crossed the first bay with no shelter whatsoever, then hugged the shoreline down here, getting a little bit of shelter. Pushing through the Route 78 bridge was tough, where the winds funneled through a narrow gap. And then further and further down here, hugging the shoreline, until it began to bend a bit to the east, when I lost all semblance of shelter. At that point, I could see the northern tip of North Hero, something over a mile away, across this tumultuous sea of waves. Now, whether my next decision was wise or not, I still don't know. But spoiler alert, I didn't drown. Unable to reach my intended point to start the crossing, I nosed out into this tumult to begin the toughest crossing I ever hoped to make. Every stroke had to accelerate the canoe from scratch and required maximum effort. If I missed a stroke, I went backwards. I was having to grip the paddle insanely tightly just so that the wind didn't rip it out of my hands. It became apparent that waves were being driven up both sides of North Hero, were converging round the top, and therefore piling up even taller. Now, I was kneeling down in the canoe, not so much for stability, that's not a problem, but to reduce windage, and I was looking up at these waves, several of them well over 4 feet high. And most of them I could ride okay, that's fine, except sometimes there'd be two cresting from opposite directions. There's no dry option then. It soon became apparent that I was not going to be able to take a straight line to North Hero. I was being driven off to the west. And at one point I did question what would happen if I just couldn't muster the strength to continue. And the answer was I'd just be blown back here into even rougher conditions on a long traverse to the northwest. So that spurred me on. So now, if the wind dropped a little bit, I made some way to the east, and then ferry glided off to the west again, east, west. In this sawtooth fashion, eventually pulled into the lee of North Hero and crawled out onto the beach. At that point, having to grip my paddle so hard, it had been a problem throughout with the wind, and my fingers were seizing up overnight. In the mornings, they wouldn't flex. It took several minutes of coaxing them to get them to flex again. At this point, they wouldn't straighten. It took a while to get them moving. I could have stayed there, but that would have put me behind schedule, which so far hadn't happened. And I was proud of the record. Or maybe I just don't know when to quit. So I now carried on and pushed south in the Arlberg Passage down the west side, the slightly more sheltered west side of North Hero. Hugging the shoreline as before. At the Route 2 bridge, the funneled wind totally spun me round. I had to retake. When I got down to Carry Bay, there was no option but a long slog of a ferry glide angling across to the east to get to the carrying place where there's a culvert under Route 2. And I pushed through the culvert into a little cove on the east side where I could now see what the lake was really like. Big rollers coming up from the south, many whitecaps. My original idea of camping on Knight Island, a mile and a half offshore, was now out of the question. I'd stayed there with Dan on one occasion. That was out of the question. My best hope was to go about a mile south and get to North Hero Village. So I edged out of the cove into the full force of the wind, dug deep, maximum force on the paddle, and went nowhere. Tried to retake and went backwards. Tried again, I was going backwards. After decades of paddling, I'd finally found the wind that I could make no progress into. Took a long time to find it. Congratulations, Lake Champlain. So I edged back into the cove to assess the options. Camp here by the road with minimal shelter, not good. Wait for the storm to abate, it might not by dark. Carry to North Hero Village, the least bad option. So, started carrying south along the road, in the shelter of some trees, knowing exactly what lay ahead. Where the road bends to the west around City Bay, there are no trees. Here, I now had the toughest carry that I've ever done. I had to lean the hull strongly into the wind to stop it from getting underneath the gunwale and just ripping it away, strongly into the wind. Frequently, I'd have to stick out my right leg as a buttress just to remain standing. Frequently, I'd have to drop the bow to the ground or put it behind the guardrail just to give my arms a break. And after an eternity of this, I was coming into North Hero Village when some kind soul came out of his house and said, "I can get my truck out and give you a hand." And once again, this really kind, sincere gesture was met with, "Thanks, but no." The goal was to be self-powered. So, a while later, I managed to get to North Hero House, stowed the canoe, booked into a room, and collapsed on the bed. I was as beaten then as I've ever been after paddling. It rivaled the fatigue of completing a 125-mile kayak race in 2004. It exceeded the fatigue of crossing the lake 5 years previously, and that was a tough one. Next morning, just how much of a beating my body had taken became apparent as I set out very gently to complete the crossing of Lake Champlain through the Ghat round Cumberland Head across Cumberland Bay. About this time, I got a text message from Vivica. Just saw news of a body found in the lake in Cumberland Bay. Please text or spot to say it's not you. My reply, still kicking. I then carried through much of Plattsburgh, but eventually had to put back into the Saranac River. And the Saranac River would have been a lovely downstream run. Upstream, however, almost continuous riffle, fairly shallow, fast, slippery rocks. It was tough work going upstream. I'd had a slow start. The nearest campsite was several miles upstream yet. I put on speed above the dams, in the deadwaters above the dams. But even so, it was getting late. Eventually, I found somebody enjoying a beer on his back deck, got permission to take out and access the road, and did the last half mile or so to the campsite carrying. Next morning, I started off by carrying. I'd have been wading in the river anyway. I carried to the first carry, and then carried through that. It was Kent Falls, Cadeville Dam. But it was my stated intent to stay in the river as much as possible. And so when I put in above Cadeville, I then did another section of upstream that I'm really proud of. I researched various exit strategies again, but each time I got to a point where I could escape the river, I chose to stay in and paddled and poled and waded up a total of probably 11 miles or so of river, much like that. And then when I finally took out, it was near where I was thinking of spending the night, but it was too early to stop. So I carried on, just started carrying, thinking to go through Clayburgh, maybe find the fishing access off Casey Road. It doesn't matter if you don't know where that is, off Casey Road, which would set me well for the trail rapids the next morning. And that's a section that's often bypassed because of tough rapids, even going downstream. So I wasn't too worried about missing this bit of the river. Well, somehow I missed the turning to the fishing access, and so ended up carrying all the way. Oh, sorry, that was my campsite that night. So this is, getting way behind here, getting carried away here. This is the Saranacas going up, a bit more of the Saranacas going up, and then ended up carrying all the way to Union Falls Dam. Another day with 17 miles of carry in total. The next day, Union Falls Pond, Franklin Falls Pond, more of the Saranac River. That brought me up to Saranac Lake Village, after which Lake Flower and Osita Lake brought me to more of the Saranac River, went through the lower lock, and stayed in a lean-to a little way upstream from there. And that evening was disrupted only by somebody on a jet ski. I detest those things. Just racing round and round in circles on probably first or second pond. Some people really don't get the serenity of a wild place. Anyway, next morning, the serenity was all mine. As I emerged onto lower Saranac Lake, the rising sun behind me, calm water ahead. And here I experienced what can only be described as an exquisite joy of paddling, where everything is perfect. Clean catch, easy pull, smooth body rotation, the canoe glides. So much of this trip upstream into the wind, all the glide had been destroyed. I had to work to accelerate it every stroke. Here, it was bliss. And then, Middle Saranac Lake, Bartlett Carry, Upper Saranac Lake, the Indian Carry, brought me to the final short downstream, Stony Creek. It's very short. Soon spat me out into the Racket River, the last major upstream. And initially that was pretty easy going, fairly sluggish. Above Racket Falls, however, it got a bit more bony and faster, had to work harder. But that day finished on a perfect long lake. It's in the Adirondacks, perfect long lake. Cooking dinner on a sandy beach. You saw that one earlier. And that was while the sun sank over the mountains to the west. There were some delightful moments.
So what time is the sunset?
8, but it was getting dark about 9. So this is now June 8th. Yeah, June 8th we're on. Next morning, set off into mist. If I hadn't turned round and looked behind, I wouldn't have seen that. That was soon all spoiled by a headwind, but I soon got back into the Racket River and carried up past Buttermilk Falls. And then the carry to Forked Lake started about 50 yards early in the middle of the river, because I just ran out of water. Then Forked Lake, into a west wind, a strong west wind, hugged the southern shore. Felt a little bit smug, but also depressed as I raced past another hapless canoe slogging into the wind mid-lake. Okay, if that's how you like to do it, fine. And then carried over into Racket Lake, fought the wind to get out of Outlet Bay, and then turned south to reach Big Island in the south of the lake, where I found another lean-to spend the night. And I'm now ahead of schedule, about the length of Racket Lake ahead of schedule. I'm as certain of completing this trip the next day as I can ever be. And I had the opportunity to spend the evening basking in reflection. I've been trying to replay the video in my mind at intervals, but so much of the time on a trip like this is taken up with the next decision, the practicalities of life on the trail, finding the next eddy, hanging onto the paddle so it doesn't get blown away, deciding whether to paddle or to pole, setting up camp, cooking a meal. All of this, it occupies an amazing amount of brain space, not allowing you to reflect. Now I could just spend an evening thinking about it. The next day, it would all be over. The final morning, day 28, started misty again. I couldn't even see the entrance to Brown's Tract Inlet, but my dead reckoning was good enough to get there. And the dark water was reflecting the rather milky sky above. Even Brown's Tract Inlet, this is a very sluggish, the last short, sluggish section of upstream. Even that was shrouded in mist and very beautiful. But that had cleared by the time I got to the boardwalk, the start to the carry to 8th Lake. And 8th Lake is the uppermost of the Fulton chain. And the rest of the trail is now a countdown from 8 to 1. 8th Lake disappeared pretty quickly. At the put into 7th Lake, I was quizzed by an agent from the Adirondack Watershed Institute about invasive species. And in reply to her question, where have you just come from? My straight-faced reply, Northern Maine, was not quite what she was expecting. Then 6th Lake, the final carry to 5th Lake. It had seemed such a tough carry as the first carry last time. Then through a little channel into 4th Lake, where I was going to meet my support crew. They were going to paddle out from Old Forge with a sumptuous lunch and then escort me home. So I met them just at Alger Island. They were paddling my other model of canoe. And we found a perfect place for lunch and trail stories. And then we set out to bring this to a close. And there wasn't much to say at that point. It was just the smooth action of paddling close to friends who, for the second time, had been steadfast in their support and generosity to make one of my dreams come true. And I said last time that I'd never had to work so hard to achieve something. This time, the physical hard work had reached new heights. I was expecting the upstream to be tough, but the headwind, which is often ferocious, had taken it to a new level. I said last time that the harder you have to work to achieve something, the more rewarding it is to achieve. And that was never truer than right now as I paddled the last few hundred yards into Old Forge and then drifted into the dock with paddle raised high. In some respects, my body was a bit broken at that point, but my soul was fulfilled. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Are you going to do it again?
You're not the first person to ask that. What is left for me on this trail would be a completely different journey. So, for example, if a friend of mine, for instance, or a relative wished to paddle it but didn't have the wherewithal to go solo, I would enjoy helping somebody do a regular through paddle. I wouldn't recommend anyone to do this approach, not as a first trip anyway. So yeah, if I could help somebody else get to the end, then yeah, I would do it again. I don't think I've got anything to prove to myself, or anybody else for that matter, in terms of solo paddling it. There are bits and pieces of it that I haven't yet seen. The real mud pond carry, for instance, which I do feel a need to go and find at some stage. I didn't take the mud pond carry the first time. I did the loop round Allagash Lake and missed it. I added some extra miles because I had some extra time. Dan.
I'd just like to make a comment that I don't even think you can imagine the severity of the difficulty of this trip. That I've talked to several paddlers that said that nobody would ever do it.
Nobody in their right mind.
The American natives went up it and they took a bus back because it was impossible to paddle back on that. This is an amazing trip. And when Peter went the normal route, he stayed in water probably longer than anybody else doing the through paddle. When I said I carried my boat 110 miles, he went the opposite way and only carried his about 50 miles. And most people are going the normal direction are carrying about 100. So he stays in the water longer than anybody and paddles water that I don't know of any other human being can paddle. I really don't.
There are other paddlers out there who would take it on, but there are many paddlers paddling this trail who rightly do not take on that sort of lake crossing.
Oh, right. Oh, no.
Yeah, it would be the wrong thing to do. You've got to be supremely confident in your skills and your craft. You've got to know exactly how it responds if you're going to take on a rough lake crossing. I have that confidence, I have those skills, fair enough, but many people don't. Fair play to them. They don't go out in those conditions, and it's the right choice.
Do you ever do any evening paddling to avoid headwinds?
No, because I was putting in long days anyway to stick to the schedule, and so to fit a 12-hour day in without going into the dark becomes difficult, especially because I needed to set up camp and cook a meal when I got to an evening. So it didn't really fit. I suppose I could have cooked a meal earlier and then carried on paddling into the evening and just set up a camp. But with eyes shut. I see no danger. Yeah.
All those boulders waiting for you.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier in your talk that you had to repair your canoe with tape.
Yeah.
My question is, what was your contingency plan for various degrees of damage to your boat?
Okay. The most likely damage would be a split in the fiberglass, and that's what I got. The hull was knocked in and it split the internal fiberglass. That happened last time in the permanent rapids on the Saranac, and all I did was to put tape over it because the hull was not structurally compromised, so I just kept water out with tape. So that was number one. Anything more severe, I could call my support crew to come to where I was, bringing fiberglass, epoxy, necessary tools, and we'd do an in-the-field repair. If it couldn't be repaired in the field, then really it was trip over. Oh, sorry? Gorilla tape. Gorilla tape, yeah. Gorilla tape sticks in the way that many tapes don't. So, yes.
Have you ever been attracted by any of the wilderness rivers of Canada? Thinking of the Voyageur routes, the Sigurd Olsen trips?
Yeah. The answer is yes, but I don't know if I'm hardcore enough in terms of the length of time, the distance of travel, the number of insects, number of biting insects. It takes a particularly special breed to take on those. And to be honest, I know this looks hardcore, and to a certain extent the physicality of it is, but I was never that far away from civilization. I could spend nights indoors along the way. So I'm not sure that I am hardcore enough to do that, even though they do intrigue me. So I'm not saying never, But nor am I saying yes. Yeah.
So you're carrying warm clothes, rain gear, kitchen gear, food. I mean, how much did your pack weigh before you even put the canoe?
Okay.
on yourself?
Okay.
Plus,
Well, yeah.
you know,
So,
50 pounds.
the canoe was 37 pounds. So with a couple of poles, paddles, life jacket, we're looking at 41. I haven't weighed it with all that in, but 41-ish. My pack, when everything was there, including a full supply of food, weighed about 48, 49. So we're talking 90 pounds maximum, which is 60% of my body weight. So yeah, it's a load, but with that kind of load on good terrain, I can walk comfortably at 3 miles an hour. I'll walk for 20 minutes, that's a mile, take a rest, give my shoulders a break for a minute, set off again. Next time, rest for 2 minutes and have a drink, set off again, and just do it in mile increments. And it's quite easy to eat up the miles that way. Now, in fact, along the Dead River, I was going faster than expected. And where I was planning to put back into the river was in fact where I should have been taking out anyway to bypass Fansanger Falls. So it was fortunate that having put back in, I took out straight away because I decided that the river was a bad move. And suddenly saw, oh, I'm here. So yeah, I was traveling at well over 3 miles an hour along the road with that kind of weight. Okay, it wasn't full weight at that point. I'd eaten some of it, but even so, it's up there. And this time with 3 food resupplies, my pack weight never dropped as far as last time. Shortly. Okay, yeah, I'll come back to you in the front.
I wondered whether you noticed any stamina change from one trip to the next.
Just in terms of the stamina, no. If anything, I would say I was probably, even though 5 years older, paddling stronger at the end of a tough day this time than I was last time. That said, this time I had, apart from the headwind, very largely good weather. Last time I had a lot of very cold weather, driving rain, cold winds, northerly winds, and that saps your strength a lot. So maybe it's not a fair comparison. But yeah, I was certainly impressed at how strongly I was paddling at the ends of some of the... lying somewhere near the Mud Pond Carry, there is a memory card up there that has proof of me paddling strongly upstream at the end of a tough day. It's on there. If anyone wants to mount a search. Yeah, you had another question.
Was your hull shape design tailored for your expedition, or is it just kind of shape you?
It's tailored to be a cruising hull. So the idea is it sacrifices a little bit of initial stability. It's got a bit of a chine. So that it's going to cut the water very nicely and be quite directionally stable. But if you heel it over a little bit, it becomes quite maneuverable. Any more? One more, Dan.
You said did you wear a dry suit?
Dry pants.
Dry
So
pants.
from the seal was round here, and the bottom's almost sealed around my boots. It wasn't a perfect seal. I got a little bit of leakage in there, but the leakage was so slow that the water warmed up as it went in. So even though it was very cold water, it wasn't uncomfortable at all.
And I
You
know
got to follow
your
up?
adversity to freeze-dried food. So did you pack any freeze-dried, or did you just go?
Just regular dried food. Order it in bulk from a company called Harmony House. I've got no affiliation with them, by the way. And then, yeah, I'll admit it. Vivica, my wife, she makes up quite tasty meals from it. I probably could, but she would tell me what to do. So yeah, just make up our own combinations, and yeah, so it is dried food. So it's lightweight food. Just add water, cook it up, and it's healthy, it's nutritious, it's sustaining, filling, hot, everything that you need at the end of a long day. Yes.
I had a question about your hands. The picture you showed close up with the cracks in the
Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One, how if at all did you treat your
Okay. I started off using Burt's Bees to rub into my hands regularly, and that clearly wasn't doing the job. I was wearing fingerless gloves. After the first couple of days, I've never liked wearing gloves, but I got myself some fingerless gloves and started wearing those, and they protected my hands except, of course, for the fingertips. So the fingertips suffered. When I got to Jackman, I got some Vaseline, just regular Vaseline, and used copious quantities of that. And that was day 8. The gig was on day 20. In the intervening time, they had healed. Yes, yeah. Despite continuing to paddle long days, yeah, they healed. Just keeping them moisturized, well moisturized, was enough to let them heal. But yeah, those splits were very painful. I had the same thing last time in the cold and the rain. It wasn't cold and rain this time, but same thing happened. One more, yeah.
Could you discuss your choice of paddles? I noticed they look like pretty hefty wood paddles.
Yep.
And certainly a trend today is lighter and lighter, carbon fiber.
Sure.
I'm assuming that's not okay with you
Right.
too.
Yeah, this is an ash paddle. I've got nothing against carbon fiber paddles. Yeah, they're beautifully light. I like a paddle for cruising in deep water with a long blade, long narrow blade, because then you can sit it closer to the edge of the canoe. Therefore, it has a smaller turning effect on the canoe as you're paddling. Therefore, you don't have to correct as much. I like having the greatest width of the blade up near my hand rather than down at the other end. Some people have the biggest area at the bottom of the blade, because that reduces the stresses on your body. Having the greatest area, the greatest force being applied nearer to your lower hand reduces the stresses. Now, obviously, a long blade like that, and this is a bit of a monster paddle. I completely unknowingly reinvented the Maine guide paddle. So I didn't know anything about it when I made this one. It's a little heavy, but not that bad. I've fined it down a lot over the years. The other one was an old kayak paddle, wooden kayak paddle, with a metal tip at each end, which wasn't being used, curved blade. And I hadn't used it in 20, 30 years. And so I somewhat reluctantly chopped the shaft and grafted a T onto one end of it. And that's what I used for my whitewater paddle. And it served very well. It's got a wider blade, shorter blade, so it's much more suited for shallow water paddling when you can't sink a long blade into the water. Yeah.
Did you use a T-handle on your flat water paddle as well?
Yes, yeah. It's not an exact T, but it comes up as a bit of a Y. I should have brought it with me. Sorry, I didn't. Any more? One more, Fran?
Did you cry at the end?
Yeah.
I mean, that was
Yeah.
a very moving picture.
Oh, yeah.
Of your last trip.
Yeah.
Parting, going back to civilization.
Oh, the one sitting beside the canoe,
Yeah.
head buried in hands. Yeah, we actually, at Fort Kent, we recreated that scene. It's on my website. The whole story you can get to from this website, and there are some business cards lying around, just in case you can't remember that, feel free to take one. And you can get to the whole of my journal. It's on there, all 28 days. And what you'll see is the recreation of this picture of me sitting by my canoe, head in my hands. This time it's sort of, what have I let myself in for? But yeah, at the end, that's what hung back, letting the others get ahead of me so that they'd have a camera ready at the end. But yeah, I hung back just before the end, just so I could be alone with my thoughts for a while. And yeah, I cried. It's an emotional thing to set up a challenge like that and to achieve it. Yeah. Yes.
What would this trip be like with in a two-person canoe?
Ask Dan. You've done it as a tandem.
Get a really, really strong mountain.
Yep.
Stronger
Yeah.
than that.
Yeah.
Stronger,
Yeah.
real strong.
It's
a lot more social.
Yeah.
And it's, there's the problem solving is that is between two people. And I don't know if you know, but the longer you're in a canoe with a person, the shorter the canoe gets. There's a lot of support.
It's sometimes said that you shouldn't try paddling too often in a canoe with your spouse.
Made that work.
You've heard that referred to as a divorce accelerator?
A
A divorce accelerator.
divorce accelerator, yep,
Yes,
that would be it.
of course.
Yeah, but yeah, as a tandem canoe, certainly, yeah, a wonderful trip for a tandem because you do not need twice as much gear for two people as you need for one person. So the loading will be much lighter overall. So you can decide how to divide up the load, but in terms of carrying, it's much easier. In terms of lifting the canoe in and out of the water, you've got two people to do it. Not having to do everything by yourself. Maneuvering up rapids, because even a conventional through paddle, you'll be going up the Missisquoi, there are some rapids on there. Maneuvering a canoe up rapids, much easier with two people, one at each end, than one person trying to do the whole thing. So yeah, two people, go for it. Yeah, don't hold back. And the other thing I'd say, and I'm not trying to be rude here, don't let age put you off. A few years back, I went and paddled on Lake Champlain with a couple who were paddling this. Both of them were 76 years old. Okay? And they completed it. It took their time, they got to the other end. Grey power. Any last questions? Okay. Thank you all for coming out.